Today on the Wealth Cafe, we are diving into all things 529 accounts. We are going to cover the who, what, where, when, why of planning for college for a loved one in your life. So let's start out. 529 accounts are to help pay for what used to be college expenses, but a change has actually occurred where you can use the funds in a 529 account to actually pay for K through 12 expenses. So let's start out with the who, and I'm going to dive more into how you can use the account and how to fund it. We'll cover all of those on today's episode. So let's start out with the who of the who, what, where, when, why. Who is anyone who's a loved one in your life? Let's say you are a grandparent and want to set up 529 accounts for each of your grandchildren as they are born. Maybe you are an aunt or uncle who wants to provide for other family members in your life. And you say, hey, my niece or nephew, I want to make sure that they go to college or private high school, whatever it may be. And you decide to set up a 529 account in their name. Anyone can set up a 529 account. You don't even have to be related. I know I gave examples just now about grandparents, aunts, and uncles. Maybe you really love the little girl across the street, or you are their caretaker and you want to set up a 529 account for them. You can do that. You simply need their information, date of birth, social security number, and you can get this account set up for them. Here's the big difference, and a question that I get asked a lot. What is the difference between, let's say, a grandparent setting up a 529 versus a parent setting up a 529? And it comes down to the FAFSA. So the FAFSA is the form that you typically fill out when your child's accepted to college and you're trying to get financial aid, send over anything for grants, scholarships, whatever it might be. And this information is sent to the school to see what type of money and funding you can get from that institution to support their college education. As a parent, when you are applying for the FAFSA, they are going to ask about 529 accounts that you as the parent have opened, or that maybe even the child has opened on their own account. So you want to be mindful of that because it could impact any funding you're getting. Some high earners sit here and they say, I don't really expect to get any funding as it is. I'm not going to sit here and worry about that. And a lot of times people then sit there and they say, okay, is the growth in the tax benefits I'm going to get from a 529, could that potentially outweigh any type of funding I might get from a school or university? Here's the caveat. Let's say a grandparent or a neighbor opens up a 529 account for your child and is the one funding it. They are subject to gifting limits, right? So for 2025, they can only put in 18,000 to that account. Or if they're married, you can double that. However, you don't have to include those numbers on the FAFSA. So if the child's grandparent opened that 529 and let's say it now has $50,000 in it, that isn't taken into account when you are figuring out financial aid and applying for any grants or scholarships for your child. So covered the who, let's cover the where. So where do you open one of these accounts? There is a wide variety of places you can use Fidelity, College of America. Now, here are some of the tax caveats. Some states, and make sure you look this up because it does vary state to state, some states will allow you to get a tax deduction for your contribution to your child's accounts. I personally live in New Jersey, and in New Jersey, unfortunately, we don't have that benefit where contributors to these accounts get that tax deduction, but some states do have this. So make sure you are looking that up and you are aware of any of those benefits that you could get on top of the tax-free growth. So let's also talk about the how of using these funds, right? How do you actually use them? As I teased before, you can use these funds now for K through 12 expenses. Let's say your child, and I actually had a client who did this, their child went to private school starting in actually elementary school. They chose not to do this, but if they wanted to, they could have started using 529 funds for this. Why would somebody do this? They might be sitting here saying, hey, my child's incredibly gifted. They might be getting a free ride to college. I don't want to do that. Or let's say your student is a senior in high school and they got a free ride. I know a lot of colleges and universities, they start signing student athletes in their sophomore year. So you might be sitting here being like, oh no, my student has already, college tuition taken care of. What are we going to do with this money sitting in a 529? A great problem to have, right? And I'm going to get to one of the changes that we actually saw happen last year to how you can use 529s, but you might decide to say, hey, you know what? We're not going to need all this money for college. My student is in a private school for high school. Let's use it. Let's use some of these funds to avoid penalties. And because there is a 10% penalty if you don't use the money for qualified education expenses, similar to a retirement account, if you're putting that connection together in your head. So you may sit here and say, okay, you know what? Let's use this to pay for senior year instead. You can also use a 529 account to pay for other school expenses. So let's say your student, they get a full ride on their tuition, but they don't for their housing. So if they're sitting there living on campus for housing, and they also still need to pay for things like books, their meal plan, all those other little added bonuses that when you get the tuition bill, they start adding up and you're like, wait, where did these extra thousands of dollars come from? You can use within limits, make sure you look it up and know exactly what expenses you can and can't use this tuition for. I always had somebody make a joke. They were like, no, you cannot use your 529 money to pay for partying off campus, but you can use it for something like a meal plan. Just make sure you keep those little nuances in mind. So we also had changes that came to 529 plans last year. So a lot of people, when I start working with them and we talk about for young kids, setting up a 529 plan, I always get the question, 99% of the time, I will say, that is, well, what if my child doesn't go to school? Keep in mind that you can use this for the K through 12 expenses, vocational schools, which is great, continuing education like a master's or other programs, just make sure that they qualify. However, a recent change occurred last year where you can actually take a 529 and convert it to a Roth. It has to be, there's a couple different nuances to this, so make sure that you look them up, make sure that you qualify and talk to your financial team before you go ahead and pursue this. However, a couple of them are, it has to be for the same beneficiary. So if you had set it up for Jane Doe, it's that Roth IRA has to be for Jane Doe. It has to be the same beneficiary. You can't all of a sudden go from Jane to John. Or as a parent, you can't sit there and be like, ooh, I'm not going to set up a Roth IRA for myself. Unfortunately, not how it works. The account also has to have been open for 15 years. So if you opened up your 529 for your child when they were 2 years old, once they are 17, you are in that 15-year mark. This is to prohibit people from all of a sudden being like, oh, let me use this as a way to get more Roth money for my child or even for me. And this stops you from being able to open up a 529. You'd have to wait the 15 years and then do it. There's also a maximum amount of money that can be rolled into the Roth. And as of now, for 2025, it is $35,000. There's some different rules that you have to make sure you're following in there to actually do the rollover. So like I said, make sure you are talking to your financial team about this. So that gives a lot more flexibility to the world of 529s, right? There's so many question marks about what is the future of education? How will things change? 529 plans have really evolved over the last several years, and we've seen changes from what the money can be used for, who it can be used for. To add another one to the who, you can also interchange between children. Let's say your firstborn ends up being an incredible basketball player as we're in March Madness season, gets a full ride. You can then sit here and say, you know what? We actually are going to need more money for our second child and transfer that 529 money to the second child. That you can do penalty free, keeping it within the same generation there. So keep in mind, there's all these different little nuances, and your financial advisor or financial team should be pointing these out to you. So before you rule out a 529, make sure you talk to them and say, hey, here are some possible different scenarios we could see happening in our family or in our life. How would a 529 plan work? Would this make sense? And I think before you rule it out or before you decide to go all in, make sure you're talking through a couple different scenarios to play out, okay, does this make sense for our life? If you want to sit down with us and ask any questions and talk through it, we have our application for an intro call. You can go to tanisfingroup.com/contact and you'll be able to apply for an intro call there, or feel free to leave any comments in here and we will try to answer as many questions as possible around 529s. I hope this was helpful, gave you an idea as to the who, what, where, when, how of these plans working. And I hope that you are able to take this and decide if a 529 plan is right for you and your family. As changes continue to come out with these plans, we will make sure to be posting updates, so make sure you are subscribed and followed along and stay tuned as changes occur. See you next week.